morning. We're in Perek Chaf Beis of Yeshaya. The Perek began on page 160 of the Art Scroll Yeshaya. Again with the word masa, a burdensome nevuah, meaning that, as we mentioned so many times, there are 10 different phrases, 10 different words that would introduce a prophecy. The word masa means a burden. It means that what the Navi is about to say will be burdensome, oppressive about the people or the nation that he's talking about. In this particular Perek Chaf Beis, it's a masa, it's a prophetic vision about the Jewish people, about Yerushalayim, about the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel. The last pasuk I believe we learned was pasuk Zayin, pasuk Vav, where Ve'elam nasa ashpa berechev adam parashim v'kir eira magim, page 164 in the Art Scroll. This is a prophecy by Yeshaya that other nations of the world will come to assist Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army to destroy Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash. In this case, in particular, the pasuk is talking about Elam. Elam was a city in Persia, and they would, the Persians, although the Persians at that point were actually subjugated to Babylon, the Nebuchadnezzar and his government ruled the immediate area, almost the entire civilized world to a great degree. The Persians were subject to the Babylonians until later the Persians take over the world from the Babylonians, and from that point forward we have Paras and Umadai, and then we have the Purim miracle. So the pasuk says, "Ve'elam nasa ashba berechev adam parashim v'kir eira mogain." In the English, Elam has taken up its quiver with chariots of men and horsemen, and to the wall they attach their shields. The Elam army is coming as well to assist Nebuchadnezzar in the conquest of Yerushalayim. Let's take a look at the page 165 in the Art Scroll commentary, the introduction to the next psukim, verses 7 through 11. Yeshaya grieves at the vision of Jewish leaders who, as Yerushalayim's downfall is imminent, are concerned only with material means to defend themselves and their city. They bring weapons from the armories, fortify the walls, and preserve their water supply. That's what we're going to read in the psukim, that the Jewish leadership will seek additional weapons, and they will fortify the cities. But it never dawns on them to turn to the one who can save them, God, who had sent his prophet to warn them that disaster awaited them unless they repented. So while, of course, we talk so much in the shiurim about human hishtadlus, human hishtadlus has to go right along with my hishtadlus can only be successful if God blesses it. So I need to turn to God to bless my hishtadlus. The Torah says, God will bless the work of your hands. There is the work of the hands, and then there's the turning to God to bless the work of the hands. So the hishtadlus depends on God blessing that hishtadlus. Of course, as we learned we did the Parsha Shir and Parshas Miketz, we read the Chazon Ish and Emunah and Bitachon, knowing where hishtadlus ends, and you stop and you put the rest of it in God's hands. Sometimes we overdo the hishtadlus, we go beyond the borders of normal hishtadlus, and that becomes a failure in emunah and bitachon, and that was one of the issues raised with Yosef when Yosef told the Sar Hamashkim twice when you get out of jail, remember me and tell Paro to free me from jail. And because he said remembered me twice, he ended up in jail for 2 more years. You don't rely on an Egyptian, a Rahab, to get you out of jail. And because Yosef did a little extra hishtadlus, which wasn't becoming of his level of emun and bitachon, he ended up in jail for 2 more years. So there's the level of hishtadlus that has to go with the emun and bitachon. And here in the next psukim, we're going to see how the Jewish people prepared themselves for the Babylonians, even when the Babylonians besieged the city. Remember, this Nevuah of Yeshaya is 120, maybe 130 years or so before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, but it's over 100 years. So 100 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, Yeshaya is already telling them, you need to do tshuva, you need to change your ways, otherwise a calamity is about to happen. And for 100 years, this nevuah remains in the minds of the Jewish people, whether consciously or unconsciously. And unfortunately, they don't do the tshuva. So let's now take a look at Psukim Zion through Yud Aleph, 7 through 11. And this Psukim will give us an idea of what Jewish people do. And this is a prophecy. Yeshaya is telling you that what I see is, rather than you doing tshuva, I see you fortifying the cities and not doing tshuva and relying on the fortifications and the weapons. Again, when we started Perek Chaf Beis, we mentioned the Rambam at the end of Filas Yisodei Torah that a prophet that prophesies that something bad is going to happen. It doesn't mean it has to happen, because people can do tshuva. As we know, Yonah prophesied the destruction of Nineveh, and it wasn't destroyed because the people of Nineveh did tshuva. That didn't affect Yonah's status as a true prophet. However, if a prophet prophesies about good things and it doesn't happen, except with one exception, which we talked about in the Rambam, other than that, if a prophet prophesies is good and it doesn't happen, we know he's a false prophet. So the fact that Yeshaya is saying these things, he's basically saying these things are going to happen unless you do tshuva. If you do tshuva, they don't have to happen. So if the first Beis Hamikdash was not destroyed by the Babylonians, it would not detract one iota from Yeshaya being a true prophet. Unfortunately, they didn't do tshuva, and there was the Churban Beis Hamikdash. So Pasuk Zion, verse 7, Vayehi mivchar amokayech the choicest of your valleys became filled with chariots, and horsemen positioned themselves at the gate. This is about the invading Babylonian armies. The chariots are coming, the horses are coming. Verse 8, Vayegal Eis Mosach Yehuda, Vatabeit Bayomahu El Neshek Beis Hayar. Verse 8, he uncovered the shelter of Yehuda. We'll soon see what the shelter is. But on that day, you look to the armaments in the house of the forest. In other words, as the Churban is about to come, you're going into the forest looking for hidden weapons. Let's take a look at the art scroll on verse 8. Vayigal es Mosach Yehuda, Hashem uncovered the shelter of Yehuda. The Holy Temple is the shelter that the Jews thought would protect them. Yeshaya decries this mislaid confidence as he foresees the destruction of the temple. The Bnei Yisrael, we see this in other prophecies by Nevi'im. We see it also in the in Eicha. We also, written by Yirmiyah. We also see it in the Kinnis of Tisha B'Av, that the Jewish people did not believe that the Beis Hamikdash would ever be destroyed. Notwithstanding Yeshayahu's prophecies, notwithstanding Yirmiyahu's prophecies, they simply would not believe that this holy place, the Beis Hamikdash, built by David Shlomo, that this was God's place where karbonos were brought to Ribono Shlom. It was the place where there was the Oren and the Luchas until, of course, they were going to them right before the first Churban. Jewish people couldn't absorb the idea that the Ribono Shlom would actually allow Gentile armies to come and destroy the Beis Hamikdash. So while the Jewish people were not doing tshuva, this is like an ironic way of thinking. We're not doing tshuva, we're doing what we want, but nothing's going to happen because the Beis Hamikdash is here, and God won't allow the Beis Hamikdash to be destroyed. So the Beis Hamikdash is going to protect us from the destruction prophesied by Yeshaya, even though Yeshaya told us that we have to do tshuva. They came to this conclusion: we don't have to do tshuva. The Beis Hamikdash can't be destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash will protect us. So Yeshaya warns them, and he says, "Vayigales Masach Yehuda." He uncovered the shelter of Yehuda. Ribono Shlom will uncover that shelter. You think it's your shelter? It's not going to be a shelter. It will not protect you. Next, in the art scroll on page 165, Vatabe Bayom Hu El Neshek Beis Hayar. But on that day you look to the armaments in the house of the forest. When it became apparent that the enemy would prevail, the people of Yerushalayim sought shields and armaments in a building called the House of the Forest. That's why the pasuk says that the Jewish people started looking for weapons in the House of the Forest. What is the House of the Forest? The House of the Forest was a building that kept armaments in it. And this is which was Solomon's summer home. We learned about that in Malachim, where he had placed, which is also in Malachim, he had placed 200 gold shields and 300 gold bucklers, as recorded in Malachim 1. The people prepared for war and placed their hope in weapons instead of God. So they went out. Shlomo HaMelech had placed a large amount of, for those days, gold shields, sophisticated weapons and defensive weapons in this Beis Hayar, in this house of the forest. They went and they pulled out those quote unquote secret weapons, and now they're going to defend themselves against the Babylonians, which is fine. You can go get those shields and you can go get those weapons, as long as you're also doing tshuva and placing your ultimate success against your enemy, not in the weapon, but in the Ribono Shlom. Unfortunately, they failed to do that. Pasuk Tes, page 164. Ve'ez b'ki'ei ir David re'isem kirobu v'tekaptzu esmei habrecha ha-tachtona. 9. You saw that the breaches of the city of David were numerous, so you collected the waters of the lower pool. In Yerushalayim, there was a lower pool of water and an upper pool of water. What does this mean in terms of defending the city? 9 in the art scroll. The stone missiles that the enemy continuously hurled against the wall caused it to crack in many places, creating numerous breaches. They used catapults to shoot rocks at the wall of Yerushalayim, and these rocks created breaches in the wall. Of course, that's what the Babylonian army intended, and from those breaches, they would eventually approach the wall and break open the wall completely. So you collected the waters of the lower pool. There was an upper pool and the lower pool. Now, what does collecting water from the lower pool have to do with the breaches in the wall? So the commentary explains as follows. Page 165. Upon seeing the cracks and breaches, the people gathered water to make mortar and clay to repair the wall. So the tragedy is getting closer and closer. The enemy is now breaching the wall. Instead of people turning insight, introspection, and doing tshuva, they're still busy trying to fix the wall. The people gathered to make mortar and clay to repair the wall. Even Ezra comments that they gathered the water to make a moat to defend the perimeter. However you learn the pasuk, the point of the pasuk is that the people were gathering water to make a moat so that the Babylonians couldn't enter the city. Or they were using the water to make mortar to seal up the breaches. Whatever the case was, they were still mentally in a place where they can defeat the Babylonians simply by war, by sealing off the city. They were still in that mental state that they can actually defeat the Babylonians. Pasuk Yud, page 164. This is a very, very interesting pasuk about what was going on in those days. Vesbote Yerushalayim Sfartem. You counted how many houses there were in the city of Yerushalayim. And they counted not only how many houses were in the city of Yerushalayim, they sort of made a list of who owned what house. So if you only owned one apartment, one dwelling in Yerushalayim, they let you alone. The Jewish people that live in Yerushalayim just left you alone. You're entitled to have one house in Yerushalayim. But if you had multiple homes in Yerushalayim, they left you with one home, and they took apart your other homes, but there were other people living in there, but that's the way things were. They left the landlords one house in which he can live, and all the other houses they took apart. So that's the way they would have stone in order to be able to build walls and fix the wall. Vespote Yerushalayim Safartem. You counted the houses in Yerushalayim. Vatisitzu habatim levatzer hachoma. You destroyed houses in order to fortify the wall around Yerushalayim. Verse 10, page 165. You counted the houses of Yerushalayim, and you demolished the houses to reinforce the wall. Commentary, verse 10. You counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you demolished the houses to reinforce the wall. The people decided to tear down houses and use the stones and wood to reinforce the walls. They counted the houses to determine how many each person owned, so that the houses could be expropriated fairly. And this is from Rashi. They wanted to do things fairly. So if a person owned 10 houses, they left him with a house. A person owned 2 houses, they left him with a house. Maybe they left a person that had a larger family, maybe they left him with a bigger house or 2 houses. But this idea that in the middle of the destruction of Yerushalayim, they're taking away people's homes, they're destroying them, they're demolishing them, taking the stones and the wood to fortify the wall of Yerushalayim, and they're doing this fairly. You make a cheshbon, how big is your family, how many houses do you own? So while there's a negative aspect to this, meaning that they're still involved in fortifying the wall, and they haven't yet done tshuva, they haven't yet turned to the Rebbeinu Shalom, they're still working on the wall. On the other hand, there's this, what seems to be positive aspect, that they haven't become barbarians inside the city which is besieged, and they're trying, in terms of being Adam Lachaveroi, they are counting the houses, they want to see what's fair to each person, and they're making these kind of cheshbonos in a very, very dire situation where the enemy's right outside the wall, and they're making Bein Adam Lechavero calculations, what is going to be fair in terms of expropriating houses. Again, they're not thinking about maybe we ought to do tshuva, but in terms of Bein Adam Lamokim, but it seems that they're still doing and working in the Ben Adam Lechaveroi and trying to expropriate the houses in a fair way. Verse 11, page 164, Umikva asisem ben hachol mosayim lemei habrei hayashana v'lo hibatetem el oseha v'yotzra meirocha glo re'isem, turning to page 166. Page 165, the translation. You made a moat between the two walls with the water of the old pool. Earlier we spoke about the lower pool. This is now the old pool. There were multiple pools in Yerushalayim. But you did not look toward the one who made this happen. You're busy making moats. You're busy strengthening the walls. You're busy taking apart houses. You're busy doing a lot of things. But you did not look to the one who made this happen. You did not turn to the Ribono Shel Olam. And you did not consider the one who formed it long ago. We're going to get to these words in a moment. These words, and the one who formed it long ago. Let's go back to page 165 in the commentary. At the end, on verse 11, the second paragraph, Volo hibatetem el oseha. You did not look toward the one who made this happen. Here, Yeshaya makes his point. The people trusted only in external protection, armaments, walls, moats, but failed to turn to the one who created, established, and protected the city until now from its enemies. They failed to understand that it was God who decreed this punishment on Yerushalayim. They failed to understand. We also have these kind of constant nisyonos to understand that God is back running the world. Of course, again, our hishtadlus and our bechira, we make decisions, and the Ribono Shel Olam basically runs the world based upon the decisions that we make. And sometimes we forget that as we're making decisions, that the Ribono Shel Olam is right there in decision-making process. To imagine that the Beis HaMikdash is actually standing in Yerushalayim, the history of the Beis HaMikdash, you're living it. You're at the end of the first Beis HaMikdash. You're not so long after David and Shlomo. And to fail to understand that it's the Ribono Shel Olam you need to turn to is very, very tragic. Beis HaMikdash is standing, and you can completely forget about the Ribono Shel Olam and the need to turn to him. That's a very tragic picture of the Jewish people. So they fail to understand that it is the Ribono Shel Olam who is bringing the enemy to Yerushalayim, and if you want the enemy to stop, you need to turn to the Ribono Shel Olam. So the last words in verse 11 that we just read, the end of page 164, V'lo hibatetem el oseha. You didn't consider the one who is making this happen. The Ribono Shel Olam is the one that's bringing the Babylonian army to Yerushalayim. And you did not consider, page 167, the one who formed it long ago. What is the one who formed it long ago? On page 166, let's take a look at a Radak, Rav David Kimchi. That's why he's called Radak, Reish Dalet Kuf, Rabbi David Kimchi. It's one of the most famous commentaries on Tanakh, certainly on the Nevi'im and Ksuvim. So the Radak on page 166 at the bottom, under the word Radak, says as follows. About 5 lines from after where the Radak begins, there's a word there, ubidrash, and there is a drasha. V'yotzra meirachok lo re'isem. Misha Bora Osa Kodem Shenivra Olam. You failed to understand that the city of Yerushalayim was one of the things that was created before the world was created. Now, everybody just be patient. For those of you who also attend the Das Tabuno Shir, or the Bereishis Shir, where we learned about Nachmanides' Pirush in Bereishis Bolakim as Hashemayim V'Sa'aretz, the Yuli particle, and the Yuli particle was created Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing. And that's a principal concept of Jewish belief. The world was created Yesh Me'ayin. There was God and nothing else. And then God willed things into being, into existence. Other than that, nothing existed before. So now let's take a look at, in fact, as we learned in the Ramchal says nothing even existed in potential. The idea that there's something called potential that can become reality, that whole idea is something that God created as well. We spoke about this week, that ideas were created by God also. No human being has ever thought of something that God never thought of. Ideas were created as well in the Sheishis Yimei Bereishis. And if they weren't created then, they're not going to be created now because of the rule of Il Chodesh Tachas Hashemesh. Ramchal explained that in the Das Tavunos. So now let's see patiently what the Radak is quoting. As Chazal tell us, this is a Gemara. Psachim Nun Dalet Amud Aleph. The Gemara there says, Shiva Devarim Nivru Kodem Shenivra Olam. 7 things were created before the world was created. Ve'elohein, these are the 7 things. Gan Eden, Torah, Tzadikim, Yisrael, Kisei HaKavod, Yerushalayim, Umashiach ben David. So if you just read the Gemara superficially, you're going to walk away with a very big misimpression. Before God created the world, he created Mashiach. And before God created the world, he created Bnei Yisrael. And he created Tzadikim, etc., etc., these 7 things. To which how do you know that Yerushalayim, how does this fit? What does this have to do with this pasuk? Because the last words in verse 11 state, V'yotzra me'rachok lo re'isem. You did not consider HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who caused the Babylonian army to come to Yerushalayim, and you didn't consider the fact that God created Yerushalayim long ago. In other words, even before the world was created, God created Yerushalayim. So you forgot 2 things in the process. While you're busy fortifying the walls of Yerushalayim and go getting weapons from the Beit Hayar, from the house in the forest, you forgot that it is God who's sending the army, the Babylonian army there to Yerushalayim. And you forgot that Yerushalayim was created by God even before he created the world. So both the army is at God's discretion, and Yerushalayim is created even before the world was created. It's at God's discretion. The Yotzra and the creator of Jerusalem, Meirachok, long, long ago, even before the world was created, Lorisam, you didn't consider him. That's why this particular Gemara comes in to focus on this pasuk. So now the Radak warns us. Ve'ein mashmos hadrash hazeh k'mo shemavinim oso hamon hatalmidim. The true meaning of this drasha in the Gemara in Psachim Daf Nun Daled is not the way most people, most students understand it. You read the Gemara and you say, oh, there are 7 things that God created before he created the world. Ela Perish, the Radak explains, Sha'amdu b'koach libarot kodem shenivra olam. This is difficult to find common ground here between the Radak and the Ramchal. The Radak is saying that these 7 things were created b'koach, in potential. because these 7 things are so critical to the world that's about to be created. Gan Eden, which means a place where a person is going to get schar. Torah, Tzadikim, Yisrael, God's Kisei HaKavod, Yerushalayim, Mashiach ben David. These things are so critical to the future to the world that's about to be created, that these things already were in potential before the physical world's created. And then when the physical world's created, these 7 things eventually materialize. That's how the Radak learning. Remember, we learned the Das Tvunos, the Ramchal said that to the extent that this idea of potential came about also after creation. This idea of potential wasn't around before creation. Here the Radak is telling us that there was a creation, that the idea of potential was part of creation before the world came into being. Because these 7 things really represent the 7 major tachlisin, the 7 major ultimate goals or ambitions for the world, or necessities for the world. And therefore, even before the world was created, the Rebbeinu Shalom created them in terms of the potential. Then he created the world, and these 7 things materialized as they were needed in the world. So that's the Radak's shot on that Gemara of 7 things were created before the world was created. So the Rebbeinu Shalom through Yeshaya is saying, listen, the Babylonians are going to come, they're going to breach the wall. If your people don't do tshuva, you're going to be running around looking for brick and mortar and wood to fix up the breaches. You're going to be running out to the Beit Hayar, the house in the forest, to collect weapons. But take a minute just to ponder what's going on. What's going on? The Babylonians are coming. Who do you think sent them? God. They're going to attack Yerushalayim. Who do you think created Yerushalayim long before he created the world? The Rebbeinu Shalom. Why don't you turn to the Rebbeinu Shalom who created Yerushalayim? And why don't you turn to the Rebbeinu Shalom who's sending Nebuchadnezzar towards Yerushalayim? Why don't you turn to the Rebbeinu Shalom and do tshuva and pray to him? Verse 12. Vayikra Hashem Elokim tzvakot bayom hahu. And this is what we talked about last week when we read the Gemara in Chagiga. That there's a place where Kav Yochel, the Rebbeinu Shalom, whatever it means, Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nei Adam, as the Rambam says in Perek Aleph of Yesodei Torah, there's a place where the Rebbeinu Shalom cries, and that place is called B'Mistorim, Mistorim Tif Kenafshi B'Pnei Kaveh. And there the Gemara has a discussion about how can HaKadosh Baruch Hu cry, not because of the physicality of crying, but this whole idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu mourns and laments. But the pasuk says, Oz v'chodel lefonav, and the Gemara there said that there's the inner chamber, the outer chamber, and the Gemara quoted this pasuk. We read the Gemara last week. Vayikra Hashem Elokim tzavokis vayemahu. And on that day, if it shall come to pass that there will be a destruction, God will call out that day levachi, for crying, ula mispay, for eulogies, ula karcha, to rip out your hair. We'll take a look at that. V'lachkor sak, and put on sackcloth. Take a look in the translation. Hashem, Master of Legions, declared that day to be for crying and eulogy, meaning probably Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction. For baldness, rip out your hair, and for the donning of sackcloth. It's a day of Avelis, Loyalena. Let's take a look now. This raises a very important halachic point. Page 166, at the bottom of the page in the commentary, the last paragraph, Ula Karcha, for baldness, rip out your hair over this tzara. We know that you're not allowed to do this. A person loses a relative, you're not allowed to rip up your skin, you're not allowed to rip out your hair. It is the things that the Torah specifically says Jews don't do. And here, the Yeshaya is prophesying that God will declare Tisha B'Av to be a day, that day when there's a Churban Beis Hamikdash, it's going to be crying, it's going to be eulogies, it's going to be rip out your hair, it's going to be donning sackcloth. Although it is forbidden to tear out one's hair over the loss of life, it is permissible to do so as an expression of anguish over any other matter. And the art scroll is quoting the Beis Yosef, who is quoted by the Ramah. So according to the Shita, while there's a biblical prohibition to rip out your hair, rip up your skin, make yourself bleed, cut yourself over lo aleinu, the loss of life, it is permissible to do so as an expression of anguish over any other matter. That's the first sheet. And since this has nothing to do with the loss of life, this is the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, it was permissible to rip out your hair. Page 167. However, Sefer HaChinuch, Mitzvah 486, and the Bach rule that it is forbidden. You may not rip out your hair for anguish, whether it's lo aleinu, the loss of a human being, or the loss of anything else. This is not a Jewish way of mourning. Noting that Rabbi Akiva struck himself in anguish, even drawing blood, when his teacher Rebbe Lezer died, Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Samach Ches Amud Aleph talks about Rabbi Akiva being near the deathbed of Rabbi Eliezer when he died. We're talking about Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes was put into Chayrim because of the famous story of Tanu Shalach Nai, which we can't go into right now. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes had a certain shita. The majority ruled against him, and he refused to give in to the majority, and he was put into a form of chayrim, and therefore people couldn't really get within his 4 amos. He couldn't teach in the yeshiva because students couldn't come close to him. He was, etc. The Gemara in Bab Metzia tells us the tragic story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes. Rabbi Akiva was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes, and right before he died, Rabbi Akiva came to see him and stood the distance required to stay away. And it's a dialogue between them right before Rabbi Eliezer dies. And when Rabbi Eliezer dies, Rabbi Akiva was so distraught about it. For the reasons the Gemara discusses, Rabbi Akiva realized all the years of Torah that he lost. The great Rabbi Akiva, how many years of Torah he lost by not being able to learn from his Rebbe Eliezer, and how many questions we had that he never got answered by Rebbe Eliezer. And now there'll be no one else to answer his questions now that Rebbe Eliezer has passed away. He hit himself so hard that blood came out. So Tosfos there in the Gemara, in Sanhedrin, Daf Samach Ches, says that the prohibition applies only when one does so in mourning for a dead person. This is similar to the Beis Yosef Shita, that the prohibition is only for the loss of a person, not over the loss of something else, such as the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Akiva's demonstration of grief was because the world had been deprived of the enormous Torah riches of Rabbi Eliezer. Here too, the mourning was over the loss of Yerushalayim and the temple, and therefore the ripping out of the hair was permissible. Alternatively, the loss of the temple is so awesome that it is the exception to the rule. So we have 2 different pshatim here in this pasuk. When the pasuk says, the Yeshaya prophesies that the Churban Beis Hamikdash will be such a calamity that God will call it as a day of crying, eulogy, ripping out your hair, and donning sackcloth. How can you rip out your hair? Either you have the shittas that hold that this is permissible when a calamity strikes lo aleinu. The only time you can't do it is when the Torah says you can't do it, and the Torah seems to specify only over the loss of life. But you can do it over the loss of a Beis Hamikdash or the loss of, for example, a Rebbe like Rebbe Akiva and the lost Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkinus. Or you cannot do it over and when he did it over Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkinus, it wasn't because of the death of Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkinus, because you can't do it over the death of a person. It was over the Torah that he couldn't learn because of the death of Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkinus. And that's one shita, that the prohibition of doing this kind of mourning, ripping the hair, ripping the skin, drawing blood, is only over the death of a person. But for example, the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, the loss of the Torah you could have learned for your Rebbe, it is permissible. The second shita is it's absolutely prohibited for all reasons. Jews don't mourn this way. The loss of the Beis Hamikdash is something beyond the pale of all kinds of mourning, and for that purpose, just for Chas Shalom, the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, the ripping out of the hair, those kind of things were permissible. That's what the pasuk does say, that Yeshaya prophesied about a day of ripping out of hair because of the Lo Aleinu calamity. Blineda, next week we're going to pick up in Perek Chaf Beis, pasuk Yud Gimel, pasuk Yud Dalet specifically. We'll go further, but we're going to look at pasuk Yud Gimel and Yud Dalet. We talked about the Jews not doing tshuva, notwithstanding the prophecy that they heard from Yeshaya over 100 years before the Churban, and that prophecy rang in their ears, and their children knew about it, and their grandchildren knew about it, and they didn't do tshuva. Unfortunately, we're going to see just how far things went in terms of not doing tshuva. It went to the opposite extreme. They even became Lo Aleinu worse from hearing this prophecy. And we're going to see next week what exactly triggered them to become even worse than they were by hearing this prophecy.